From the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., this is the Tyler's Place podcast, the podcast by brothers, for brothers, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction. I'm your host, Maynard Edwards, 32nd degree KCCH. You know the drill. Email me anytime, podcast@scottishrite.org. And if you get a second, go to scottishrite.org and log in. And when you log in, check out the brand new online member ID card. You'll see it right there. If you haven't set up your online portal, go ahead and do that first, and then you can log in and see your Scottish Rite ID card. So if you don't want to carry the paper card with you, you can log in anywhere. And yes, it can be used in lieu of your regular member ID card that you get every year. You'll still get that one, but now you've got one that you can get online, and it's on your phone, it's on your laptop, it's on your tablet, however you log on to scottishrite.org. You can go right there and check out that brand new member ID card. And I want to throw up a quick thank you to the guys who sent me birthday greetings this month. November is my birthday month, and I got a bunch of birthday greetings from a bunch of you guys. So thank you very much for remembering. Brother Art and I are going to talk a little bit about that later on. But if you don't get a birthday greeting from the Supreme Council, my buddy Bob Weatherford, he sends out hundreds of birthday greetings every single day, and he sends each one. And if you reply to Bob, he will in fact reply to you. This isn't some automated deal. He will actually respond. There's a real person at the other end of that. And Brother Bob does a fantastic job keeping up with the birthdays. And if for some reason you're not getting your birthday greeting from the Supreme Council and from Brother Bob, well, that means we don't have your right email address. So log on to scottishrite.org, sign up for the online portal account, and make sure we've got your correct email address and birth date, and you will get that birthday greeting. That much I promise you. One of my favorite things about working in the House of the Temple is that virtually on a daily basis, I have new brothers stopping by to say hello. Sometimes they're from up the street, and sometimes they're from across the country, and it's always great to be able to chat with one and to share that common bond of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And so a couple of weeks ago, a brother dropped by. I got a text message from Brother Dan Jones down in Nashville. He's the secretary there, good friend of mine. Sent me a text and said a guy was coming to visit us. And I got to sit down with this brother, and it turns out we share more than Scottish Rite Masonry. We're both musicians, although he is an absolute ringer, having played with some huge names. And so it was great to sit down and talk to a Scottish Rite brother from Nashville.
Walter David Smith of the Nashville Valley, Orient of Tennessee, 32nd degree Mason.
Before I get into talking about your stuff, I want to say you've gotten as a Scottish Rite Mason, you've gotten your first peek at the glorious House of the Temple here, our fine home, your home. What do you think?
It is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. The architecture is beyond belief. The archives are incredible. We just left the library. My wife is with me, Jill, and we just left the library. And
she's a librarian, so she knows what she's looking at.
As she knows exactly what she's looking at. And I'm telling you, if you're a brother or not, listening to this, you need to come see the library. If nothing else, come in and see the library. It is amazing, absolutely amazing, the works that you have here.
You are a session musician, a studio musician, a touring musician. You're a professional Nashville go-to cat.
Exactly. I've been recording professionally since about 76. My first gold record that I ever played on the Million Seller was group Alabama, a song called Tennessee River. And that was, so I did their first 3 albums, I believe.
Your wife corrected you. She said 4.
My wife says 4, so I guess it's 4. And I've had the honor of recording with so many country artists that are doing television with them, such as actually recording with George Jones, Loretta Lynn, awesome. Gene Watson. And I've got stories, some I can tell, some I cannot tell, about the artists. I don't have any and also artists that you would not associate with recording. I did 2 CDs for Dennis Chester, Gunsmoke, the Limpin'
Now, one of the stories you were telling upstairs as we were taking a little look around was that one of your most recent big touring jobs, and I know you're doing mostly studio stuff now, was on the road with Don McLean. And for those of you who don't know Don McLean by name right this minute, if you're a little younger or maybe not a music file, you certainly know Bye Bye Miss American Pie, Drove My Chevy to the Levee. And if you haven't sung that a few dozen times in your life, I'm going to ask how you managed to get yourself a cell phone to listen to a podcast. But So tell me a little bit about that, because, I mean, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame member, I mean, legendary songwriter, composer, beyond American Pie, Starry, I mean, an icon.
He really is. And was a nice guy to work for. I toured with him for 5 years. So, but it was a great job. He had, and like you were saying, brother, he had so many. One of my favorite parts of the show was, when he would just take his guitar and in the middle of the show, he would stop and he would do tunes that he had written that you never heard, that were never on records, that were never on CDs. And they were just jaw-dropping songs. It's like, wow, you should do this. And actually, he did a song, one of my favorites, called I Was Always Young. And it's a very telling story. And I would ask him before we'd go on stage, hey, you gonna do I Was Always Young? He said, it hurts too much. Wow. So when you hear the song, and it is online, if you hear the song, you'll know that he wrote that for someone, and it is tough for him to sing. But it was so cool when the very first night I went to work. I flew to California to do a television show with him, and he was looking for a bass player. So after the show, he asked the drummer, who was a good friend of mine. He said, "Are you happy?" And Jerry said, I'm happy. And he looked at me and he said, if you want the job, it's yours. And that was it. And so I said, that's great. You do hundreds of songs, and I don't know hundreds of songs that you do. And he said, well, if you'll notice, there is a chair for everyone on the stage. And he said, if you don't know the song, don't play. Sit down and listen. And he said, when you know the song, stand up and play. He said, I toured for years when Pie came out. He opened for like Grand Funk Railroad and all these big bands, and it was just him and a guitar. He said, I'm used to doing it by myself. Don't worry. He said, when you learn it, play it.
Wow.
And it was the job was that laid back. It really was. And occasionally he would do stuff where the guitar player and I would just have to sit. It's like, man, this is good, but I don't know it. And he was very, very lenient with that. It was a tough touring job, because when he does England, or if he does Europe, or if he does Australia, you work when you're there. Like you'll work 3 days and have a day off. And on that day off, you're flying across the country. And
tell me about your journey in Masonry and Scottish Rite Masonry.
Scottish Rite Masonry began 2 years ago. In the Nashville Valley, Tennessee, Orient. It was, I went through the Blue Lodge, in 81, was raised in 81, and, got out of Masonry as you do working and growing up, and got back in, about 10 years ago, and always wanted to go through Scottish Rite. It was always an ambition that I had, and I am so glad I did. I enjoy Scottish Rite Masonry as much as anything. The esoteric of it, the degrees are actually it is very eye-opening and very life-changing, as the Blue Lodge is. The Scottish Rite, to me, helps to define the focus. It actually helps define the focus and different aspects of your life. And I've tried to use it every day. the certain degrees you will take personally. You will take things from the 7th degree judge and provost. To me, is one of the most eye-opening. The 31st degree, which is from basically Book of Dead of Egypt. It's all extremely. You can use pieces of all of it in your personal life, and it to me is just a more defining. It makes you that much more a better man if you can apply.
I don't think we could say it any better than that. That's Brother Walter David Smith, 32nd degree from the Valley of Nashville. He is a professional touring and recording bassist in the Nashville scene and has been for many years. Great to visit with him on his stop by in Washington. And if you're coming to Washington, D.C. and planning to visit the House of the Temple, I'd love to hang out with you and chat with you on the Tyler's Place podcast. Send me a message, podcast@scottishrite.org, and let me know when you're planning your visit so we can catch up and sit down and chat and get to know each other and understand a little bit more about this great thing we call Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And somebody who knows a lot about Scottish Rite Freemasonry coming up right now, our educational correspondent, Brother Mark Oldknow, 33rd degree from the Valley of Santa Fe, now officially the personal representative to the Valley of Santa Fe. Brother Mark, always great to have you on, and happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. Where do we go this month? Take it away.
You know, one of the things that we've talked about up to this point is that that virtue is the basis for any notion of leadership. And it's important to understand that leadership can be thought of as having kind of two components, broadly speaking. One is sort of the basic, what makes somebody a leader. And then there's the skill set by which they express or they engage in that leadership. So that may be communication or strategic planning. The bottom line is you can teach somebody skills, but you really have to develop yourself and through yourself the basic foundations that make you a leader. I want to keep concentrating for a little while on the notion that and the role that virtue can play in forming that basis. Once we have that basis in place, and once we understand as Scottish Rite Masons and Scottish Rite Orients and Valleys how to grow that basis, how to develop that basis, then I really do believe it becomes a question of plugging in some of these additional tools like strategic planning, like communication. We can teach that, but we have to develop the basis. Otherwise, we're just going to provide a lot of skills to people, but they're not really going to go anywhere with it. They're not going to have that background. So once again, I want to continue looking at virtue. So what I'd like to talk with you about today is what's called the paramitas. So this comes from Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. And paramita is a Sanskrit word that, and it's important to remember that the Buddha was actually born and lived in India, not in Tibet. The transition over to Tibet happened centuries later. The word paramita literally means an excellence, a virtue, or a word familiar to us as Scottish Rite Masons. It's generally translated as a perfection. So it's a process of taking something and developing it so that it perfects it, it polishes it, it makes it more pointed for its purpose, it makes it better enabled or better aligned to engage in this notion of right conduct, of being able to engage in and impact a greater good. So amongst the Buddhists, there's a tradition of these paramitas. Now, the core set of them presents 6 related virtues, kind of a network of virtues. There's other models of the paramitas. In some instances, there's 10. In some instances, there's even more. But the general consensus is it can be boiled down to 6. And that's going to be the model that I approach with you all today. So let me describe what each of the 6 virtues are and speak a little bit about how they can be helpful to us here in the West. And as non-Buddhists, I'm a Buddhist practitioner. I don't consider myself necessarily a Buddhist. And then we'll talk just a little bit about what you might do with those. So the first paramita, the first perfection, is called the dana. It means generosity for giving of oneself. So Buddhism, and particularly Mahayana Buddhism, stresses as a first step, as a preliminary virtue, is this idea of getting outside of yourself. If we're so focused on ourselves all the time, it's really hard to engage in a greater good, or at least a greater good that doesn't involve necessarily you all the time. So the very first step is to develop a sense of generosity, a natural generosity. This is much more like what we mean by charity in the strict sense of the word, and we've spoken about charity before in agape. So it's not giving money because you're supposed to. It's not giving money because you're going to get a tax write-off. It's giving because you step outside of yourself, and the right and the proper thing to do is to share and to participate in altruism. The second paramita is called the sila, and it literally means virtue itself, or discipline, or right conduct. The idea here is that if you're engaged in doing a lot of things, or even just a few things, that you know you're not supposed to be doing, that aren't productive, that may be vindictive, that may be angry or hateful or hurtful or selfish, the idea is that even if you're not actively reflecting on the consequences of those behaviors and the negative consequences, there's a little voice on your shoulder. There's a little voice nagging at you that you've done something wrong. You may experience it as guilt. It may be kind of a little bit sub-threshold of that, but there's going to be a little sense that something in what you have done, in your alignment with the world, is not correct. The third paramita is called the Kshanti, and this is one that's sort of familiar to us as Scottish Rite Masons. It means patience or tolerance, forbearance. Another word that's often used is endurance. So it's the ability to be able to tolerate differences, either apparent or real differences, because once again, even though that does many things, it educates you, it exposes you to new ideas, but again, it does the basic thing of virtue. It gets you out of yourself. If you can tolerate the presence of something that you perhaps don't agree with or don't understand, not only do you have opportunities to grow, but you've got an opportunity to be something a little bit other than what you are. You can entertain something that's not currently a part of you right now. The fourth paramita is called the virya, means energy or diligence, the ability to focus, to have right and focused effort in what you do. The next virtue that kind of builds on virya is called the dhyana. It's one-pointed concentration. A word we would normally use in my traditions is this is meditation or contemplation. It's the ability to take that focus and kind of turn it back inside and be able to look at the self and see yourself with some honesty, see the world around you with honesty, and be able to just sit with it. Dhyana can be thought of as a synonym for what we call in the West these days mindfulness training. Look it up. I'm not going to take some time right now to go into mindfulness. Maybe we'll do that in a future episode. But there's all kinds of information these days. Heck, it's turned into an industry. Leads you to the sixth or the final, the culmination paramita, which is called prajna or wisdom. This is enlightenment. This is the understanding, the dawning of who and what you and existence and reality really are. It's not my job here to tell you what I think it is. It's your job to explore it in yourself. And by using all of these 6 ideas, generosity, right conduct, tolerance, energy or effort, concentration or meditation, and finally, wisdom, all form together to make a package that perfects us, that polishes us, that makes us better human beings, and in culmination, all together, makes for a better society. Brethren, I want to challenge you to pick one of the 6. Some easy ones would be start with patience or toleration or generosity and practice it. Try to find at least one point during the day where you can actually consciously practice being generous. That's a fairly easy one to do, and God knows there's enough need out there in the world. It's also pretty easy to have to practice patience. But you have to practice it. You have to be consciously trying to grow this in yourselves. You can't just read about it. You have to get out and you have to turn it into an action. You have to do it.
100% great advice. You have to get out there and practice those virtues. Sounds a little silly in the abstract, but when you really think about it, practicing your virtues is something important, something all good Scottish Rite Masons should do. Thanks for the tip. Brother Mark Oldknow, our educational correspondent. You can always ask him a question or tell him a topic you'd like him to tackle. podcast@scottishrite.org is the email address. Now moving on to our next Masonic rock star, the one and only Arturo de Hoyos, who is, like myself, a November birthday, and we got to joking around about being fellow Scorpios, and it brought up a question about the Scottish Rite and using astrological symbolism. I know it's touched on here and there in our degrees, but what was Pike's view on astrology? Did he generally viewed it as, kind of mumbo jumbo for the most part?
He did. He viewed it as nonsense. Pike was a very critical thinker on things. People might not really realize that, because when he was a younger person, like many of us, new in Masonry, he pretty much absorbed everything that he read and assumed that if you're writing about Freemasonry, that it must be true. But the older he got, the more critical he became about things like that. He didn't become sarcastic about things, but he did become certainly much more critical about it. He still had an interest in things like Kabbalah, but he referred to numerology as tricks done with numbers. He had the idea that if there were any astrological associations in Freemasonry and the rituals, they didn't really teach anything, and he thought that Masonry was intended to teach, a type of morality and philosophy.
Well, yeah, and that was going to be my question, is that, obviously in the year 2019, almost 2020 at this point, we know that things like alchemy and astrology are pseudoscience. It's not a legitimate. I don't want to say it's not legitimate. I don't know how to say this without insulting people who do find some comfort in those types of things. But we're not talking about medicine where it's a specific spelled out, proven science with the scientific method and all of those kinds of things. It's a little looser than that. But for a philosophical system and organization that uses those symbols, I was always wondering why there wasn't more astrological stuff. And is it just because the 27th degree is loaded with numerology? As they get into the talking about as for instance the fact that the words chalk, charcoal, and clay, their Hebrew numerical values for those words sum up to the same as Solomon, and that seems a lot like numerology to me.
Well, it does. I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss astrology outright. And I don't mean to say that, I'm a guy who checks his horoscope every day or anything.
Oh, I do. It's such a guilty pleasure.
But what I mean is that, I have an interest in, for example, Jungian psychology. And Jung talks about synchronicities, which are meaningful coincidences. And his notion is that events that happen at the same time retain a certain quality of the moment that is somehow definable and even expressed by astrological archetypes, things like this. So, I'm not quick to dismiss that stuff, but to say it's kind of funny how you can see a relationship between the symbolism of astrological types and, sub-events or personalities and stuff. And in fact, it's a little known fact that Jung worked with Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, in developing his theory of synchronicity, and that he helped Jung draw up and examine astrological charts and doing the statistics, which led to their opinion that there was some kind of an acausal relationship between events that we now call synchronicity.
Well, sure, and that was sort of the basis of our discussion yesterday, that anybody who knows either one of us and knows anything about astrological signs would be able to pin us both as Scorpios. But that's why I was curious as to what Pike's view on it was, specifically because and as for instance, we use in the Scottish Rite, we use alchemy, not because anybody can really transmute, iron into gold, but symbolically as men, we are going from a raw base metal such as iron into a more noble, pure metal as gold and refining ourselves. So in that way, we're sort of emulating the theoretical alchemical process. And similarly, in astrology, you would think that's for something that is so rich with symbolism that we would also borrow from that.
Absolutely. I'm fond of saying that Freemasonry really didn't invent its symbols, that we appropriated them from other sources because there's no really reason to reinvent the wheel. But again, it is almost coincidental. I'm not saying that this applies to everybody, but there are certain, as I say, personality types or things like that sometimes seem to be very much in line with their astrological characters. So I don't want anybody, jumping out and saying that I'm cuckoo for believing this stuff. That's not what I'm saying at all. There's nothing wrong with looking at these things. If you look at something like Morals and Dogma, Pike certainly does a tremendous survey of comparative religion. And, some people will argue that what is religion to one person is mythology to another. So it's just how close do you want to look at some of those things?
Yeah, what is that? It's the 32nd degree, isn't it? That, what is...
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to go in, we're going to destroy these paintings on let's not destroy what we don't understand type of thing. You never know.
Inquisitor Commander. Yeah, 31st degree.
31st, excuse me. You know what? I just saw that 2 weeks ago. I should have had that closer to the top of mind. You sit in those degree reunions after a while and things start to, what degree are we on? Okay.
That's right. We refer to that as drinking from the fire hose.
Yes, amen. Last month, our question was, and this is a really interesting one, and I have to admit, I haven't had a chance to do any of the research myself. A lot of times when you ask, I'll go and look and try and figure it out on my own, but this one I hadn't had a chance to. It is what is the advantage to owning the single volume of Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry versus the multiple volume Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Mackey?
Yeah, that's right. And I'll say this as a person that owns the 1, the 2, and the 3 volume editions. I really prefer the first volume because in the first part of it, it's only Mackey's words. You know what Mackey actually wrote, what he thought about things, and there was an appendix that was added to it later in the back, but that's very clearly somebody else's work. You can look and see that. But what happened in later editions is they added that material in the appendix into Mackey's, and then later editors also added their opinions to what Mackey did. And so it's really confusing. I've seen many people say, well, Mackey says, and then I've looked at the article, and it's actually not anything that Mackey wrote. It was really an article that was added to the encyclopedia. I get the fact that, editors are prone to do those things, but as a writer myself, I like to be very clear as to who thought what.
Well, yeah, and I mean, when you did the annotated edition of Morals and Dogma, there is no ambiguity as to what portions you wrote versus what portions came from Pike's original text. Let's not say that Pike wrote it, because as we know, he was a liberal theft
borrower.
Well, that's what B.B. King said. When you steal from one person, it's called plagiarism. When you steal from many, it's called influence. So, that's kind of where Pike is.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, of course, in my annotated edition, everything that I wrote is in the form of footnotes and commentary. It's never added to the original text. I mean, so you can see what Pike had.
And in these Encyclopedia of Mackey's, which I have flipped through, but honestly have not read word for word. It's all blended in, so you can't, other than the fact that once you become a student of Mackey's voice, you can tell when it's somebody else writing.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. But it's kind of frustrating because when I was a young Freemasonry, and one of the first things that I did was purchase a 2-volume set of Mackey's Encyclopedia, that famous brown fabricoid edition that looks really nice. Everybody's got it. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. And I read all this stuff, and I was kind of confused that Mackey would write some things one way, some things another. It seemed to me like 2 different voices. And then I later discovered that's in fact what happened, is that, Hawkins or Hayward or whoever it was that was or McClanahan or whose ever voice, was pushed in there with Mackey really did not represent what Mackey thought about things. And Mackey had a lot of ideas that were very forward-thinking for his time, I think. And so it's important to understand, who is actually saying what.
many guys who got the answer. So of the correct answers, we will draw out a winner. Now let us move on to the question for November of 2019. Wow, we're creeping up on the end of the year.
Oh my gosh!
We enter a whole new decade tomorrow. Next, in a month and a half.
That's too crazy to even think about. What Masonic degree influenced the Royal Ark Mariner degree? And I know that sounds like a tough question, but if you're a reader of Scottish Rite literature, you are, in particular Scottish Rite Research Society literature, you'll know that answer.
All right, there's a clue for all you guys that have volumes of Herondom sitting on your shelf. You might want to start looking through those. And if you come up with the correct answer, digging through those beautiful pink books, that, by the way, the best $50 in Freemasonry, then send your answer to us. You can email us to podcast@scottishrite.org. And do not forget, you can answer anytime because
we don't pick an answer until just before the show. And to add one more thing, you might just not want to look at Herondom, but some of the bonus books, too.
Oh, look at that. Boy, it is the season of Thanksgiving. He's been charitable. I cannot believe it. He gave a hint. He hates giving hints.
Yes, I do. I was thinking more of Christmas. That's my Christmas gift. Probably the only one I'll give.
Yeah. Good old Scrooge over here. So, Brother Art, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.
That's going to wrap it up for the November 2019 edition of the Tyler's Place podcast. I'm your host, Maynard Edwards, 32nd Degree KCCH. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. And in this season of Thanksgiving, not only thank you for being a listener to the podcast, but thanks for all you do for Freemasonry, for Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and for the things that you do in and around your community that really make it a much better world. So thank you all so very much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time right here on the Tyler's Place.
If you're interested in becoming a Freemason or in joining the Scottish Rite, email us at podcast@scottishrite.org.